afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending our CTL webinar today. Today, we are going to be talking about Voices of Pride, and we have three faculty members here who are going to present to you today. So we have Dr. Judy Cannon, we have Dr. Beth Arrigo-Patrick, and Dr. Valerie Glass, and they will be our presenters today. Before we get going, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. So firstly, this is being recorded and will be posted on the CTL webinars page in the comments. Give me a few hours after we're done to get that all set up, but you can access the recording there. So don't feel you need to scribble down notes or anything like that. Just give your full focus to the webinar today. Secondly, as attendees, you are muted. So don't worry about fiddling about with trying to get yourself muted. You are already muted. Obviously, we welcome questions, comments, whatever you would like, and we have a couple of options. You'll see both a chat feature and a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. So you can feel free to ask questions or make comments there at any point during the presentation, and we will have points throughout where our presenters will address those questions or comments. So on that note, I will hand it over to Dr. Glass.
Hi, everyone. We are very excited to present some information to you today. We are going to go through a brief history of basically how did this Pride Month come about? Where did that come from, and the history of that. Then we're going to move into talking about stories or situations that some of your colleagues, faculty, friends have been through that'll help you relate to those at North Central University. And then finally, we're going to go into discussing how you might be able to advocate for your colleagues, your friends, your family members when we talk about LGBTQ persons. Before we get started, I thought we would go through a quick round of introductions and discuss why we're here and what brought us here. Judy, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Judy Cannon, pronouns she, her, hers. I've been teaching at NCU for a little over 2 years, and I'm really excited about the seminar. I wanted to tell you just a tiny bit of my story, and I'll tell you why at the end. I was married for 18 years and had 2 children and had only experienced opposite sex attractions. I can't really rewrite my history and say I was born lesbian or bi, but when I was single in my 30s, I fell in love with a woman in a relationship that lasted 11 years. When you've been on the planet a long time, you get lots of long-term relationships. At that time, I identified as lesbian by choice. When I was 50, I met my current partner. We have been together for 21 years and have a 17-year-old daughter, Sage, whom my partner carried. My partner identifies now as non-binary with pronouns still she, her, hers. So I have begun to identify as queer because it fits better for me and is more inclusive. Our daughter identifies as bi and has dated both boys and girls. So we have a family that's kind of been all over the spectrum. Part of wanting to share it with you was because I do believe there's more fluidity than we sometimes acknowledge, and I want you to avoid making assumptions when you see, for instance, a gray-haired lady, what's going on with her, and to not put people in boxes. I'll talk about that a little more in my part of the session about how you can encourage people to tell their stories. Thanks.
Beth, would you like to go?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Arrigo-Patrick, and I have been teaching for North Central for about 5 years in the marriage and family therapy program. And I identify as a white cisgendered female lesbian. And I think similar to Dr. Cannon, even my own experience of my sexual orientation can shift based on potentially the partner that I'm with. And I say that my most recent partner, although our relationship started off in a more kind of typical lesbian relationship, as my partner's gender identity shifted a bit, we ended up in what we would then call a queer relationship. So I think some of those some of those words might make sense to some of you that are listening in, and others, some might feel a little jargony. Ideas of queer relationship, cisgender, some of those pieces. And so feel free to ask questions about those throughout the presentation so that we can address those as needed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do a brief introduction for myself. And as we started the webinar, I said, this is about the time the UPS truck goes by and my dog will bark. And as a result, he is barking. So I apologize, and I promise it won't last very long. My name is Valerie Glass. I've been working at North Central Marriage and Family Therapy. We're all from Marriage and Family Therapy for 5 years. I love it here. I think North Central is an amazing place. Very accepting of my identity as a lesbian, and I feel very open and honored to be here in that respect. I have been out as a lesbian for over 30 years, which is pretty surprising to me that I'm old enough to say that. I have been in a variety of relationships, and in one of my relationships, I decided that I wanted to have a child. We weren't necessarily married or super committed, so now I am a single mother of a biracial child, and I tend to think that my identity right now is single mom rather than anything else, because that tends to take up most of my time and energy. One thing that I think you'll see as we weave through the history and other ideas of this presentation, you'll see us talking about that intersection, the intersection of who we are. I think the intersection of being a single mom, you know, people see me as just that, and they don't recognize that I do have an identity when it comes to sexual orientation, you know, because they see single mom first. They also see my face as white. They see me as a white woman first. And so those are the intersections of my identity that have played a role in what we present here. And I'm going to get started here talking about history. Before I get started about talking about history, I want to share with you that I am not a historian. I am not necessarily an LGBTQ historian. However, I have had a lot of experiences myself, and this history is founded in, you know, historical fact. However, it really is basis coming from my own perspective, my own experience. Now, when we talk about the Stonewall Riots, Stonewall happened in 1969. I was not born in 1969. However, the repercussions of the Stonewall Riots played a role in my coming out experience. And so I did want to throw in a caveat there that this history of pride is really from my perspective as a lesbian, my perspective as a white woman, and the perspective of my own experiences. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about Stonewall. I know that some people have heard the term, the Stonewall Riots, and how that has influenced what we call Gay Pride Month now. The Stonewall Riots was in 1969, so we are celebrating an anniversary this year of these riots. So what I want to talk about is what happened before the Stonewall Riots. And to do that, I want to sit there and envision what you know about the 1950s and 1960s. You know, you think about family, the idea of the, you know, suburban rural or neighborhoods with husband and wife, 2.5 kids, white picket fence. That was like the image of the 1950s and what it looked like. And imagine if you were considering same-sex attraction during that time, or you were thinking, hey, you know, I don't necessarily understand why people are labeling me a male when I feel like I'm a female. During the 1950s and 60s, that was pretty unheard of. What you saw happening during that time was all these underground clubs, bathhouses, gay men bathhouses, places that were in dark alleys around the corner underneath different buildings, you know, that nobody could see or get into. So what I have presented here are pictures of a club I went to in the 1990s called the Paddock Club. And it obviously wasn't around in 1969 when Stonewall was around, but it had that feeling. It was you know, in the back of a building. It was unlabeled in the front. And, you know, we had to park in a dark alley, walk down a dark alley to get there. It was kind of creepy, and you felt like, okay, maybe we shouldn't go here. You know, there's something sleazy about this. It didn't feel right. But then when you got in, there was LGBTQ people and supporters and whatnot, and it felt like home. You know, there were people that we knew. It was a good place. And so when I think about what was going on with Stonewall, which I'll get to in a minute, this Stonewall was a club. It was a nightclub, and it was a place of safety. It was a place where LGBTQ people from the 1950s and 60s could actually go and meet people who also had same-sex attraction, who also liked to participate in dressing in drag, who also may have been identifying as transgender, though that word was rarely used at the time. So it was a safe place to be yourself, to admit your identity, to hold your partner's hand, those kinds of things. And so, you know, there was a sense that you went into this back alley place, but yet once you got in, there was a sense of safety here. And so that's just a couple of pictures of places that were similar. This is actually the Stonewall Club at the time. So wasn't so back alley. It was on the block of a lot of other LGBT friendly establishments of the 1960s in New York City. So there was a lot of community in that area at the time. During that time, there was a lot going on politically in New York City, and there were in place what we call sodomy laws, basically stating that any sexual activity other than the quote unquote missionary position was considered illegal. And they used that law to entrap LGBTQ folks in these different bathhouses and bars and whatnot. And so this had been going on for a while in this, you know, couple of blocks of the New York area. And Greenwich Village is right there next to it. And so people were getting not just arrested, but often, like I said, entrapped, but also abused by the police and others because of their, you know, sexual activity. Even just holding hands at the time could get you arrested. Kissing, anything affection-wise. There was a unusual law about you had to wear at least 3 items of your sex, you know, and otherwise you could get arrested. So, you know, drag queens were trying to figure out a way to wear 3 items of expected male attire, and so that they wouldn't get arrested. So there was a lot of interesting things going on. And most of the time, prior to the Stonewall Riots, you know, LGBTQ people were going to jail. They were getting arrested. They were dealing with this abuse. They were dying. They were getting abused to the point of, you know, dying, and their families had basically kicked them out of their family gatherings. So they were lonely. Their family was their community here in this area. So in 1969, what happened was it was one of those nights where the police were coming to raid the Stonewall Inn. And this is something I didn't know before doing this presentation, but the Stonewall Inn was actually owned by the mafia. And they were making a lot of money off of these LGBTQ establishments. I don't want to get into all of that, but it's an interesting fact. And the mafia would typically tell the patrons, hey, the police are coming. So the patrons typically knew. But for whatever reason, this night, nobody knew. And the police came in and raided it. There were people getting hit, you know, there were people that were getting arrested, getting handcuffed, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened is when people were coming out of the bar handcuffed and whatnot, there was a lot of community in the area, people from other bars and restaurants, and they had had enough. They didn't want to see their brothers and sisters in this kind of situation. So little by little, the crowds kind of grew and started protesting, you know, we're not going to take this, you know, this, you know, let our folks go, you know, we don't want this happening. And, the police began to get scared. There was a time period during this where the police were locked in the Stonewall Inn, and they were in fear. There was also patrons in there as well. There was a lot of things going on. But long story short, the riots lasted 5 days. And in addition, other organizations came to join them. An interesting fact is the Black Panther movement nearby decided to join in the riots because they had negative feelings towards the police at the time as well. So it was an uprising against police, and a real interesting situation occurred. So that has been considered the inception of the LGBTQ Pride Month. It was in June 1969. A year later, there was the first Pride Month, or the first Pride Festival, I'm sorry. The first Pride Festival, and I'll go through a little bit more of that history, but I like this picture because it shows where the Stonewall Inn is now. It's celebrated, it's part of the LGBTQ history, and it's very much, you see the flags, it feels good. It doesn't feel like the back alley kind of dark place that it once was. So let me move on a little bit here. So what I was talking about, 1960s, there was the 1970s, as many of you know, there was a lot going on. The feminist movement, you had civil rights movement, you had a lot going on at the time. And the gay movements kind of tapped into some of these, but also had their own movement. So you had a lot of things going on at the same time. But since the Stonewall Riots and that first Gay Pride Festival, you had a lot of festivals starting up in the larger cities. You had San Francisco Pride Festival, New York Pride Festivals. Another interesting fact is the bookstores. You started seeing a lot of gay and lesbian bookstores. And I'm going to use gay and lesbian because in the 70s, that was the term that was used. It wasn't LGBTQ. That has evolved over time. So there were gay and lesbian bookstores, and the growth in education on LGBTQ history because of these bookstores. People could go to this safe place and learn about our history, and folks that were writing fiction and nonfiction and things that spoke to. I remember going to my first gay bookstore and finding, oh, I can buy a novel on this teenage lesbian couple, and it was a really fun experience. But I can't imagine being in the 1950s and 60s and then moving into this 1970s period where this stuff was available, and you could actually meet people in these bookstores, and it felt, again, like that safe place. All right, a picture of a gay pride festival in the 1970s. So also in the 1970s, there was a politician named Harvey Milk in San Francisco, California. He was the first openly gay politician, and he was elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. He was also assassinated a year later because of his gay identity. And there is a movie called Milk that I encourage you to watch based on that time period if you're interested. So the 1970s was kind of this time of, okay, we're connecting, we're learning about ourselves, this is our community, defining what that meant. And lesbians were having a voice for the first time, saying, hey, gay men have always been the homosexuals, but, lesbians said, hey, we want a voice too. So that's why I say the gay and lesbian movement was a big part of that, because it went from gay to gay and lesbian. Women became a more vocal part of the, festivals, activities, pride, whatever. So the 1980s brought some interesting changes. The AIDS epidemic became a major killer of gay men in many LGBTQ communities. And because a lot of LGBTQ communities were in specific areas, like if you think of San Francisco, there were several blocks where mostly LGBTQ folks, they were friends, it was, you know, your chosen family, and men were dying. And it was terrible. At first, AIDS was called the gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. And that in itself was scaring the world, you know, scaring the United States. Our societies were starting to say, hey, wait, you know, in the 50s, we thought homosexuality was scary, but now look, it could actually infect us and kill us. So there was a lot of stigma around AIDS. What happened is lesbians and gay men started to really come together because they had to fight. They had to fight to get health care. They had to fight to get equal rights when it came to this AIDS epidemic, and get funding for research because it wasn't happening. So there was a sense of unity in that. And what I have here is a picture of the AIDS quilt, which I was lucky enough to see in the 90s. It basically, a lot of people were dying, and these were folks that were not part of their families and not celebrated in quite the way that they should have been. And so the idea was, let's make a quilt. And so there's a little square for everyone that had died of AIDS at that point. And they were showing the quilt in major areas across the country, and you could go look. And it was a very touching experience to go and witness this quilt and to really respect those folks that had died, and what that meant to the people around them, their chosen family most of the time. So after there was a bunch of steam built up in this, you know, healthcare, you know, AIDS crisis events, the 90s, which is the time period I remember the most when it comes to LGBTQ history, there was a lot of weird politics going on in the 90s, sort of this back and forth idea. I remember when Bill Clinton was voted into office, and there was a lot of celebration among a lot of LGBTQ folks because he had made some promises to our communities. At the same time, soon after he was elected, he created the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law, which in the military highlighted if you were gay or lesbian in the military, you couldn't tell anyone, and they couldn't ask you. So it wasn't that you weren't allowed to be in the military as a gay or lesbian person, but no one could talk about it. What an interesting law that is, if you think about it. It's kind of like saying, hey, you can be a woman in the military, but don't tell anyone you're a woman. You know, it's just interesting that it went that way. And I think Bill Clinton would probably argue that was the best he could do, and he did something, but, you know, who knows? You know, we can always wonder how politics went that way. In addition, there was the Defense of Marriage Act that was 1996, and that defined marriage as, legally defined marriage as one man and one woman. And that was definitely controversial at the time, and a lot of LGBTQ persons were responding with marches and you know, letters and even trying to get elected to change some of that. A year later, Hawaii was the first state that said, hey, wait a minute, let's take a look at this. The one man and one woman, you know, states may not have to follow that. It did take a while for things to change, and we'll get into that in a minute. At the same time, there's the Defense of Marriage Act there. At the same time that this was happening, there was a lot of visibility in the media. You know, Ellen, if you ever watch the Ellen DeGeneres show, you almost always hear about this experience. She was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom for actually coming out and saying, I'm proud, I'm me, and I'm going to tell everyone. And it was a scary time to do that as a celebrity because you just didn't know what would happen. And so she did that, and that paved the way for a lot of other celebrities to come out after her, shows to be created that were very LGBTQ positive, that kind of thing. On the sad side of that, I wanted to bring out the Matthew Shepard. Some of you have heard of Matthew Shepard. He was tortured and, roped to a fence to die because of his gay identity. And that was occurring. I mean, people were dying because they were gay before that. However, there was something about the time period where the social stigma around that, people were outraged, and not just LGBTQ people. It seemed like the country was outraged that that had happened. There seemed to have been a shift, that we don't kill people because they're gay. That was a shift in thinking, and seemed to be changing in this era. So real quickly, I'm going to go through a little bit about more current day history. Most of what's been happening over the last 19 years is a lot of politic things going on that have really changed. When I think about same-sex marriage, for example, that was legalized down here in 2015, it has changed the language around gay and lesbian identities. And just saying I can get married makes a big difference to me, because whether I want to or not, I am legitimate. I can legitimately have a relationship in just the same way as my peers, my friends, whatever. So there's a legitimacy to some of these politics. So just real quick, you can see there, Vermont became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. In 2003, 2004, 2008, more states began to legalize same-sex marriage. In 2009, Obama created the Hate Crime Prevention Act, which basically added penalties if your crime was because of hate, rather than just a murder for another reason. In 2011, there was a repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law. So the military servicemen and servicewomen could openly now serve. In some ways, that the military has changed a lot of our thinking, because they had to figure out a way to add same-sex benefits to married service members because of these changes. And let's see. So more recently, we've had a little bit of a twist in politics, as this year, Trump put a military ban on transgender service members. I do think that there's a lot going on with that, and that may change throughout the next couple of years. We'll see. We'll hope so. And I can't go on without talking about the Pulse nightclub shooting. I think it really highlights where these last 50 years have gone when we think about the Stonewall Riots and people coming in our safe places and killing or attacking LGBTQ folks. And I think the Pulse nightclub shooting really brought out a lot of re-traumatization in a way for many LGBTQ folks, because yes, it was a mass shooting, and that's going to affect all of us, but this was particularly on a safe nightclub, that safe home place that a lot of LGBTQ people feel. In addition, it could have been us, think about all my nights at a nightclub, and this could have been my experience, and it's very sad to think about. So I'm just going to end this part of our presentation with a few pictures here on where are we today? There seems to be an increased visibility. The fact that I can come here and say, hey, I'm a lesbian and I'm going to present a webinar. What an amazing thing, and how much further we have come as communities to be able to present in this way. There's celebrations. You talk about gay pride. I've seen gay pride everywhere. We have gay pride shirts, which we'll show you in a minute, NCU pride shirts. And, you see pride festivals going on everywhere. There's a lot happening. And I think, you can see on here celebrities and politicians, and there really is an outspurt of growth. In addition, I find that I'm going to end with the idea of intersectionality. I have found in this gay community that we are opening and expanding in ways I don't think we realized. A couple of years ago, I went to a Black Pride Festival, and there's Latino Pride Festivals, and there are other areas that have burst out of our LGBTQ identity, and so we can capture everyone that's inclusive in our community. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Beth to talk about stories of experience.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, just kind of pulling off of that last slide of yours, I do think it's also really relevant to also mention that although we've come so far, there is still so much violence against, especially Black trans women. And just, I think in this month alone, we've had 4, maybe 5 now, women murdered because of their identity. So I think even in the celebration and the visibility and the ways that we've changed for so much good, there's still lots of room for our work and advocacy efforts. So that said, I think that what I'm going to be talking about is just highlighting a few people that are historically really important in the movement, are also maybe had nothing to do with any of the LGBT movement, but are also really prominent figures in our society, in culture, in business, in science. We really wanted to be able to talk about and highlight some people that might be interesting to folks at North Central based on whatever program of study you might be a part of. And so then after I do a little bit of that, I have a few stories from some of your fellow students. I think most of them are all from students actually, or alumni. And I see that a couple of you are here. So hello, good to see your names in the chat. And I'm glad to have you guys here adding to this conversation as well. But these are just a few people I wanted to introduce you to or reintroduce you to, but just know that there's so many more people you might know about or want to learn about. People like, I'm just going to name a few people that are not on this list, but people like Laverne Cox, Alicia Garza, Janet Mock, Senator Tammy Baldwin, Ellen DeGeneres, which thankfully we've already mentioned, and so many other people that I could have included. So just forgive me if I haven't included somebody that you really were hoping I would include. So the first one is Sylvia Rivera, and she, along with Martha P. Johnson, they were both very connected to the Stonewall Riots and are very well known in that movement. So the two of them are the first two here. Sylvia has been quoted to say that she was the second throw of whatever it was that they were throwing at the police that day. So these two, I think, self-identified drag queen, transvestites, were very, very important to that part. And not just to the riots, but also to the community at large. The two of them came together to create a lot of work for homeless trans youth in New York City, and just did a lot of work around that. Similarly, Sylvia really, she pushed back often against sort of the white gay and lesbian agendas, and really wanted to bring in voices from the margins, voices from drag queen perspectives, voices from Latin America perspective. And so that was a really big part of what she brought. And so I mentioned about Martha as well. So those two really, a lot of their history is sort of connected together. You can learn a lot about them through lots of, I think they're also getting statues near the Stonewall. I think that's been sort of a new thing that I've heard. Moving on to Audre Lorde. So she is a very well-known self-proclaimed writer, feminist, womanist, warrior, civil rights activist. Really her writing did a lot to kind of express anger and outrage around systems of oppression. And she's been talked about as somebody who, even in that passion and that activist voice, was able to really reach masses of people. She's still very well revered today. The next here on this slide is Bayard Rustin, and he was a part of the civil rights movement and was really connected to Martin Luther King Jr. and because he was openly gay, he was sort of kept in the background, because the movement was something that he was still really influential about, but still in a way not from the front lines, in maybe ways he might have liked to be. He also was really a part of coaching Dr. Martin Luther King on the pacifist types of activism. And moving along to James Baldwin. So some of these names hopefully you're very familiar with. James Baldwin is a writer, very well known for, again, writing that was really connected to socio-political movements, and writing a lot about exposing discrimination around Blackness, and then also exposing discrimination about the intersection around Blackness and queerness. And his writing is still, I think even recently, one of his books was just made into a movie. So the influence of his work is still present in this contemporary time. He was born in the 1920s, so his work has been around for quite a while, but still really influential. Barbara Giddings, the last person on the first column, she really worked prior to Stonewall for a lot of rights for queer people. And then also, I think one of the kind of later things that she was credited with was helping to remove the designation of homosexuality from the DSM, and that happened in 1973. So she was a really key part of that advocacy work. And then we see Barbara Smith, and Barbara Smith, she helped build a visible Black feminist movement during a period where one didn't exist. And so as a Black lesbian, really interested in creating space for Black women writers, she championed that and made some amazing progress. Then Alan Hart here, he's a Yale-trained public health expert and researcher. He was really big in the fight against tuberculosis and created a lot of progress in that area. He also was one of the first female-to-male transgendered people in the United States to undergo a hysterectomy and live the remainder of his life as a man. Then we have Alan Turing, and Alan, we're all benefiting from his work as we are all connected together. He developed the very first Turing machine, which is how computers were finally kind of came to be. He also, his work also helped to break one of the Nazi codes in World War II, and but subsequently in England, being gay or having intercourse or having some sort of gay experiences was still very criminalized. So in that time, he was charged with what did they call it? Sorry, indecency. Yeah, so he was charged with indecency, and the story goes on in a much more tragic way. So, but he still had such an important hand in World War II. Then we have a much more contemporary look at Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. He has, always been privately open with his sexual orientation, but when he came out publicly in 2014, he was identified as like the first out gay man on Fortune 500 list. And then this last person is Seth Pearson. He is an associate and business lawyer in Boston. And one of the reasons why I just wanted to have representative of some more contemporary people is that he has been identified as one of the best and brightest LGBT business leaders in America. He worked for the Obama administration as a White House intern in the executive office. So again, there's so many more people that we could have covered here, but these were just a few highlights. So we can go ahead and Yeah, thank you. So this slide just, we've all alluded to this when we were introducing ourselves, or even as Valerie ended her section, but I just wanted to at least take an intentional moment to say that the value of recognizing how we're not all single storied, right? I am not simply Beth D'Arigo Patrick, the lesbian, but I come with so many other identities and so many other parts of me that intersect to make meaning and create different experiences of various identities that I hold. And so that is one of those pieces that each of the people that I mentioned, right, I highlighted various aspects of who they are and what they brought to the world. And yet that's still, there's still probably many other facets of their experiences, their identity constructions that we could have explored. And it also connects as well to this idea of, intersectionality within Kimberly Crenshaw. Her definition of intersectionality really highlights the fact that when we have multiple intersections of identities, especially if they're oppressed or targeted identities, that can be really, it can be places where there's increased oppression experiences, where there are increased challenges within workplaces, increased challenges within educational settings. And so to note and notice and be aware and be present to asking questions. And I think Dr. Cannon will get into that in a bit, but being really connected to the fact that we all have so many facets of identity that come to build up who we are, and those change often. So next, I will start to share some of the stories from our students that wrote in, and I know you all can read, I'm sure, but I will go ahead and just read these as well to give them a little bit of voice. So this is from a student named Sandy. She says, my now ex-partner and I were an early part of the baby boom in Boston in 1989 as the 18th baby born via artificial insemination through donor sperm at Fenway Community Health Center. This was not widely known in my community. But when my partner became pregnant and I had to decide how to come out at work, as a lesbian, but a lesbian with a child, I was in upper middle management in a very conservative hospital in Boston at the time and was not out, not even to my close friends. But as the due date got closer, I realized that I wanted it known and told a few select close friends at work. About a month later, the hospital held a baby shower for us, much to my amazement and shock. The senior hospital administration even came and celebrated with us. It was the first time I was out at work and felt entirely supported and embraced. That was a huge turning point for me in both my career and in my life. Though we've come a long way since 1989, and my life has changed also, that experience of modeling same-sex parenting and couplehood in a large and public way had a huge impact on me and on my children. Another student, Savannah, she shared this experience. I've been part of many LGBT-related socio-historical movements, including a counter-protest of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church at the Rhode Island State House in 2013, when Rhode Island recognized same-sex marriage, as well as suing the city of Savannah, Georgia, with the help of the ACLU for breach of freedom of speech when the city banned signs of the 2018 St. Patrick's Day Parade due to Vice President Pence's visit for the parade. It's empowering and gratifying to be a part of a rainbow wave of people, young and old, standing up for human rights to those who seek to openly oppress us, but chasing down the vice president with a sign that says, Black Lives Matter and protect DACA, while wearing a shirt that says, Gay, Irish, Proud, is a lot different than being confronted by a strange man on a dark street while holding my wife's hand. That's when courage takes on an entirely different meaning. And one from Vic, who happens to be on the call with us. So Vic, he shared that, and a lot of his story really coincides with some of the history that Valerie shared as well. around experiences in Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I was really thinking about you, Vic, as she was sharing those slides, wondering what you were thinking and what you might add. But he says, I was in the Air Force for 22 and a half years, pre and during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Since retiring, we have both been very active in the LGBTQ plus community. Even during my service, we were active, although quietly, in the community. I had to stay in the background or risk discharge. And after several near-miss events, I chose to retire from the job I truly loved rather than continue to risk our future. After going through what we did with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, my husband and I were willing to fight for the right to marry so that others did not have to endure those challenges. In October 2013, my husband and I became the 2 male plaintiffs in the successful Texas same-sex marriage ban challenge. In preparation for filing the suit, I had to approach my boss to let him know that we would be pursuing that course of action. I approached him on the subject as a precautionary measure, as I didn't want the university to receive negative press or outcome for our personal actions. Although he not a member of the LGBTQ community, his reaction after I laid out our intentions was, "That's a lot to take on, Vic. Are you guys going to be safe?" His response, focused on our safety and not the impact to the job, university, or clinic, was incredibly affirming in making me feel like I was part of a family and not just tolerated or endured. Since then, I've become the faculty advisor for the campus Pride student group and watched in Yes, Pride, as the university has become an incredibly accepting place. And then our final student experience is from James, and James says he talked about several things. I'm highlighting a couple of the things that he shared with us. But he was really present to the experiences of his friends who were dying of AIDS. So watching all my friends die of AIDS as a young man while my straight friends were enjoying themselves. Gay men were dropping like flies while straight people were just having a great time enjoying their friends. Those experiences of watching people die left and right and center has affected all of my life, education, and relationships. And he was really, it looks like really a part of so many of the social movements, marching in the first gay pride parade, helping to get the gay rights bill passed in New York City in March of 1986, knowing the man who created the gay pride flag. And he was also a member of ACT UP, which I don't know that, I can't recall, Valerie, if you mentioned this. So ACT UP was the political movement that really pushed the government to actually do something about the AIDS epidemic. So James was a member of this ACT UP advocacy group, and marched to protest lack of governmental action on HIV/AIDS. And I just wanted to give you a few highlights for some additional resources if you're interested in more queer stories. My personal favorite from these is this top one. I love podcasts, and Query with Cameron Esposito. She interviews somebody who identifies as LGBTQ plus weekly. And so when I listen, I feel like I get introduced to just somebody totally different than I might have ever encountered in my everyday life. And I just find it quite valuable to see how these folks, whether they're actively influencing queer community and advancing any sort of policy, or just within their own communities at home and with wherever they're a part of, the stories that are shared there, I think are really valuable. So I encourage you all to go there. It's a free podcast. Thank you. And now I'll pass it on to Judy.
You'll need to unmute yourself, Judy.
Get there. Thank you.
Thank you. I've done that before.
Yes. Wanted to thank Beth, and to also thank the students for sharing their stories that makes it so personal and real for us. So I want to take just a couple of minutes and talk a little bit, not just about what each of us can do to create safety, but also how we can signal safety, because people do, it would be easy to assume that a place is not safe for an LGBTQ person. So we can signal that. We can signal language with our language. When we're having conversations, we can ask about spouse in a gender neutral way. And one of our students shared a story about that. I'll share in a minute. We can ask about pronouns, but when we ask about pronouns, as I was reading some of this, that apparently now in groups there's often just sort of a pronoun go around, but we also need to create safe space for people who may not want to share pronouns, who may not want to be called by their old pronouns but not ready to out themselves with new. When people share their pronouns, I think it would be great to honor those pronouns and whatever name they have for themselves and the language they use about who they are. Encourage people to share their pronouns in your biography and in your signature block. This normalizes it for everyone and makes it not just so that people who are transgendered are out there alone sharing pronouns. I think in our offices, or our homes, we can create lots of signals again for it being a safe space. The internet is full of symbols. I've included a few here: the rainbow flag, the transgender flag, HRC stickers. Lots of images are available, and we can use those again to sort of signal that this is a safe place. When we were first being asked to do this presentation, Dr. Goodwin shared that her husband uses a coffee mug at his office that has a rainbow flag to indicate that he's an ally. So I thought that was a great story. As you're building a business in whatever form or interacting with people, to really pay attention to using forms that have inclusive language, parent and not father and mother. Our daughter has 2 moms. I'm forever crossing out father and writing mother on top of it, to offer multiple gender choices and to ask about pronouns. I think it's important, if you have any input in your workplace, to help them have clear, defined policies of non-discrimination and inclusion. If you have to do with hiring, to actively recruit, to go to websites that can recruit minorities of all kinds, including gender and sexual minorities, and to look for those opportunities to advocate for the LGBTQ community and creating safety. When someone corrects you, be gracious, and that's where I wanted to share. Jane Russ shared her story on the Commons with us, and this is what she had to say. My experience occurred at the office. At the time, I was a department manager and had a new employee in my office, welcoming him to the area and completing the typical onboarding process. I'd heard from Office Talk that he was moving to the area, had sold his prior house, and was coordinating the arrival of his things to his new house. During our office meeting, I asked what his wife thought about the move. To my dismay, he promptly corrected me by saying his husband was thrilled to be moving and was anxious to get into the new house. It was apparent from the nonverbal response I had offended him. I apologized for my assumption, and we moved past the matter pretty quickly. Bottom line, I have not made the same assumption since that awkward exchange. Diversity is a two-way street and a give and take for all parties involved. And I appreciated Jane's graciousness about that, and we will make mistakes in language and pronouns, but we can be gracious and apologize and continue to work on doing our best. We can also, whether we are LGBTQ or straight or identify in some other way, we can speak up when there are inappropriate comments and jokes are made. Finally, I would just come back to my kind of original point. Don't assume that you know who people are or what language they want to use for themselves. Don't put them in boxes. Several have spoken of the intersectionality and what kind of comes forward. When Valerie was telling her story, I can remember sitting in a panel presentation for a college class where we were talking about gay issues, and I had realized at that point in time I'd become so immersed in my identity as a mother. It's like I wasn't even current on some of the LGBT legislation that was going on. I was paying attention to education and taxes because I was raising my kids. So those intersect and they shift in terms of what's forward, but don't put people boxes, and always be mindful for those opportunities that you can advocate and make a difference. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And we've had a lot of comments throughout. I'm sure you guys have seen it. A lot of feedback on the content and just very, very interesting presentation. But before we sign off, we have a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. Someone did recommend a YouTube video, which I don't think everyone might have seen in the chat, so I wanted to bring that up. If you're not able to access the Harvey Milk movie, there is a YouTube video, The Life of Harvey Milk. So
I think it's The Time of Harvey Milk.
Time of Harvey Milk, okay. Yeah.
And I would like to just make sure I correct, thanks to James. It's not Martha P. Johnson, it's Marsha P. Johnson. So just so everybody knows that is definitely not what it should have said. So thank you, James.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
I know.
Yeah, in case anyone's going to do some research or whatever after the fact.
You know, I want to mention real quick, like reading the chat feed after I presented, I was just, I mean, the history that we have here at North Central, and you know, when I talk about like that sense of home, it felt like home to read that. Like, oh, you know, we're here, we're in it together. We've had these experiences, and to know that there are folks at North Central who've been there and done that and are part of this community. So that was nice to see, and I hope that those of you that maybe don't identify with the LGBTQ community felt that as well and were able to absorb that for this hour presentation at least.
Absolutely. And then Vic, who was one of the shared stories, he had a couple of interesting pieces of information. Obviously, you guys discussed Ellen DeGeneres, and he noted that in her book, if you haven't read it, that she actually wasn't able to get another job or part, you know, in a movie or TV or whatever for 1.5 years after coming out. So it, you know, wasn't necessarily as easy for her as it may have seemed. Also that he knows the lawyer involved in the case in Texas that actually that went to the Supreme Court that ended up banning laws against same-sex. So I hope I'm saying that right. That's was just jumbled, but yeah. So it was very interesting. There was 2 men, and the police broke into their home and caught them, or thought they caught them, and he said that actually there's nothing going on, but they decided not to fight it because they wanted to go to the Supreme Court so that it could be dealt with appropriately. So I thought that was really interesting.
Let me just add one real quick thing before we end.
Yeah,
there is the LGBTQ Commons. Feel free. I will check in there periodically here in the next few days. If you have questions or comments, I saw somebody wanted to share a story, you know, please, that's a great place to do it. You know, you know, anyway, so yeah, that's it.
Yes, exactly. We're just coming down to time. But another recommendation, Love Is All You Need, a movie that someone found on Tubi that I thought was really good. So, all right. Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending. As I mentioned earlier, this will be recorded and posted in the Commons on the CTL webinars page. So definitely check it out there, or recommend it to friends and co-workers who didn't get to attend today. But thank you again, and everyone have a good rest of the day.